Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, August 22nd. Today is day 321 since October 7th. In terms of hostage ceasefire negotiations, Joe Biden stressed the urgent need to secure a Gaza ceasefire hostage deal. He pointed to the upcoming talks in Cairo that were scheduled to begin today and a phone call he had with Prime Minister Netanyahu. According to the White House, the two discussed U.S. efforts to support Israel, quote, against all threats from Iran, including its proxy terrorist groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, to include an ongoing defensive U.S. military deployments. Netanyahu has showed a willingness to compromise in negotiations with Hamas in his call with Biden, according to the Washington Post. They cited sources from the Biden administration who said that Netanyahu's being reasonable. Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but they were talking about whether or not Israel would remain along the Philadelphia route, which is between Gaza and Egypt. The reporter said that senior officials in Washington are vexed by Netanyahu's foot dragging in negotiations, but they believe that Sinwar wants a deal, but they think he might be stalling because he's waiting for Iran or Hezbollah to attack. So that's from the White House. A senior source in the government in Israel said Netanyahu has not changed his position or the need for control, and that the Israeli presence in the Philadelphia route is not in question, that the Israelis will not leave. So who knows what's happening in that regard? The heads of Israel's Mossad and Shin Bet arrived in Cairo for discussions on the Philadelphia route and also the Rafah crossing, which used to be, the main entry and exit point before it closed, with an Israeli source telling Haaretz that these are the preliminary talks ahead of the ceasefire negotiations summit that now is said to take place on Sunday in Cairo. Egypt is requesting the U.S. to guarantee that Israel will not return to the Philadelphia route, even if there is a deal or if a deal fails after its first phase. That's from the Wall Street Journal. Israeli negotiators proposed the establishment of 8 observation towers along the route. So as Israel wants 8 observation towers, the U.S. has conceded that Israel could have 2 observation towers. And Egypt, to my understanding, limited understanding, but my understanding is that Egypt is supposed to have control of the area from the peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. Egypt has rejected any observation towers at all, saying that they reject all Israeli military presence in the area. U.S. Secretary of State Blinken has spoken with the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Al Thani, on ongoing efforts about a ceasefire. That's according to the State Department. The two agreed no party would take any actions that would undermine efforts towards such a deal. U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, told the Security Council it's a decisive moment for ceasefire talks for the region, and so every member of the council should continue to send strong messages to all actors in the region to avoid actions that move us away from finalizing this deal. Of course, everyone's waiting. Hezbollah and Iran have said that they would wait to see what happens here before counterattacking. The IDF said signs of gunfire were found on the bodies of the 6 hostages that were recovered earlier this week in Han Yunis. 4 additional bodies, seemingly Hamas members, were found next to the hostages with no gunfire marks, according to the IDF. They gave their findings to the families of the hostages. They noted that this is a preliminary report and it was not a cause of death. Hostages and Missing Families Forum said that the government in Israel's decision to pre-record the October 7th memorial ceremony without an audience reflects the government's fear of looking the families of the hostages and the murdered and the displaced in the eyes. They're not taking genuine responsibility for the abandonment. This is hostage families saying that they feel abandoned by their own government. Also, Margalit Moses, a former Hamas hostage whose ex-partner Gadi Moses is still held captive, publicly rejected an invitation to meet with Netanyahu, saying she will not take part in a meeting just for the sake of a photo opportunity or PR, while her friends are languishing in the tunnels in Gaza. She said, I see no reason to meet with someone whose actions have proven that the release of hostages are not a priority and who has left them to die. In terms of Israel and Lebanon, hostilities have continued. 3 mortar shells exploded near a northern Israeli city of Metula. A fire broke out after a rocket launched from Lebanon fell near a school in the city of Kiryat Shmona. And the IDF has said that they destroyed Hezbollah targets in South Lebanon last night. Aid agencies in Gaza, I wanted to be sure to share this, that CMEP partners with, have announced urgently that there are forced displacement of thousands more people from Deir al-Balah in Gaza who are being forced to flee again. This is not only disrupting aid, but these new displacement orders are once again forcing mass movement of families and humanitarian workers from areas throughout Deir al-Balah, one of the only remaining areas in the occupied strip with essential infrastructure and warehouses that stores aid and supplies. Many families have been forcibly displaced countless times since October. They're on the move yet again, including humanitarian aid workers who provide critical aid that is so incredibly limited at this moment. At least 24 NGOs have reported impacts from these orders over the past weeks, resulting in the forced displacement of staff members, operations disrupted, and at least one site sheltering civilians under attack. These evacuation orders issued by authorities on the 13th, 15th, 16th, and 21st of August continue to obstruct aid agencies and operations. So pray for these aid workers. You know, when you look up the definition of ethnic cleansing, it says rendering an area ethnically homogeneous by using force or intimidation to remove people from a given area of another ethnic or religious group, which is contrary to international law. And so the forced displacement of people time and time again is literally the definition of ethnic cleansing. The IDF said its forces had intensified their activity in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza and Han Yunis in the south, dismantling military infrastructure, locating rockets, and killing dozens of Hamas militants over the last 24 hours. So you can hear the difference in the ways that the story is told. IDF called on residents of the north and east Han Yunis to evacuate to the west of the city as well. An Israeli airstrike on the northern Gaza town of Beit Lahia killed 11 people. Another 6, including a local journalist, were killed in a Gazan camp of El Maghazi, medics in Gaza said, and 5 others were killed in other strikes in the south, just in the last 24 hours. The most recent death toll is a minimum of 40,265 Palestinians killed, a minimum of 93,144 wounded in Gaza. The Israeli police arrested 3 adults and a minor suspected of carrying out terrorist act against Palestinians. This is in response to those violent attacks I've been talking about in the Palestinian village of Jit that happened last week. It took a week before the police arrested anyone, but 3 people have been arrested, 3 Israeli settlers. An Israeli drone strike on the city of Tulkarem in the West Bank killed 3 Palestinians. The IDF said a drone targeted a group of armed men. There were 5 reserve soldiers accused of severely abusing a Hamas police officer in the State Taman detention center. Their house arrest has been extended by 2 weeks because evidence indicated that it should be, and resignations are being called for in Israel. Former IDF chief and ex-war cabinet member Esenkot said that all IDF commanders involved in October 7th and its failure must resign as soon as there's a break in the war. These are excellent people who are committed to Israel, but they're in charge of the biggest failure our country has seen since the establishment of the state. So everyone from the level of brigade commander to the prime minister must end their duty, and it needs to happen soon. Since June in Israel, there's been an injunction from the High Court to put a hold on a probe to investigate the failures of October 7th. And the Israeli state controller, Engelman, said that the negotiations with the IDF and the Shin Bet over whether or not the investigation should proceed have failed. The IDF, Shin Bet, and Attorney General argue that this investigation would be a violation of Israeli national security, but the state comptroller disagrees. And today it was announced that the second U.S. aircraft carrier, the USS Lincoln, arrived in the Middle East amid fears of a broader regional conflict. This was escorted by guided missile destroyers. It was equipped with F-35 fighter jets. It joins other ships in the region, including the USS Theodore Roosevelt aircraft carrier that arrived in mid-July. Defense Secretary Austin ordered the Lincoln to the Middle East as the U.S. prepares to defend Israel against an expected Iranian attack. Finally, the parents of Israeli-American hostage Hirsch Goldberg, who was abducted by Hamas on October 7th from the music festival at Nova. His parents spoke at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago on Wednesday to shouts of bring them home. His parents, Rachel and John, talked about bringing the hostages home and how this is not a political issue, it's a humanitarian issue. There are still 8 American hostages believed to be held in Gaza. The parents talked about bipartisan support to bring hostages home. Churches for Middle East Peace has been calling for the hostages to be returned home since October 7th, and we stand alongside of the Goldbergs and all of the families of hostages. We long for them to be brought home. And I feel particularly close to their story. Just a few days after October 7th, I was supposed to share a stage with a dear friend of Hirsch. I learned about his personal story, the fact that his arm had been blown off by a grenade before I even knew his name. I later watched the horrific videos of October 7th and saw him thrown on the back of a pickup truck. I've listened to interviews from his parents begging the Israeli government, the American government, anyone that would listen to offer assistance. I do not begrudge them from speaking, and I stand with them on calling for their son and all of the hostages to be returned home. So I wanted to share that. I do also want to share, I grieve that not one perspective about the loss of Palestinian Americans over the last 10 months was shared from the stage. 2 Palestinian American teenagers were shot by Israeli soldiers and killed earlier this year. There are so many Palestinian Americans whose lives have been lost, and there was not one representative of a Palestinian American perspective. Everyone was denied from speaking at the Democratic National Convention. For example, why weren't Barak and Hashim, why wasn't their family allowed to speak? Barak and Hashim Alaga, their ages 18 and 20, they were born and raised in West suburban Lombard, just outside of Chicago, before their family eventually moved to Canada and then to Gaza. They're dual American-Canadian citizens. In February, the Chicago Sun-Times told their story about these two brothers and how they were taken in an Israeli raid of their Gaza shelter, and the U.S. failed in their attempts to secure their evacuation out of Gaza. Their cousin in Chicago has been pleading with the U.S. to secure their evacuation. She and other Americans sued the U.S. State Department and said there has been such disparate treatment of Palestinian citizens of the United States who've sought to flee Israel's bombardment of Gaza compared to Israeli Americans who were quickly helped after the October 7th attacks by Hamas. So there's a lot of contention around what's happening at the Democratic National, the DNC, the past few days. Pray that the conversations in Egypt are successful. Pray for the release of Hirsch and all of the hostages. Pray for all of those Palestinian prisoners held unjustly in Israeli prisons. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds. Pray that negotiations for a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire would be successful and come to fruition. Pray for the lives of the more than 2 million people in Gaza who have suffered more than 10 months of a catastrophe and trauma. Their lives depend on it. Pray for peace and for justice in the name of Christ. Amen.